All right, Jabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin a good tavach. I thank you, very special thank you to Moshe Abramson for helping us, for working through all of the technical challenges this morning. Baruch Hashem, a great zichus to begin another week with all of you. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Selma Wolf, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month with immense gratitude for the refuah from Hashem and the merit of a refuah shlema for all of those in need, and the zchus of our brave soldiers, and in merit Hashem and the zchus of the return of all of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsor is this week Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter in memory of Rabbi Yehuda's father Asher Buchwalter on the occasion of his first yahrzeit. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Leah and Alan Zeiger in memory of their great granddaughter Rus Ahava Bas Yedidya Meir, and Dr. Moshe Gavant on the 52nd yahrzeit of Rebecca Saknoff Rivka Bas Chaim Zichron Devracha. We hope then in the merit of our Talmud Torah the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. We also dedicate, of course, all the Maseches Baba Kamma Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Elio Michal Charush Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah his neshama will have an aliyah and his family a nechama. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Gimel 73, and we are picking up Emeretz Hashem on Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph 73a at the two dots. At the two dots, which are 2, 4, 6, 8 lines down from the top. So just to orient ourselves a little bit. So if you remember again, halacha l'maisa, we are in the midst, embroiled in this dramatic machlokes in Abaye and Rava about when Eidim are found to be Eidim Zomin. This feels much more like a Meseches Makkos sugya than anything else, but or Sanhedrin. But which it is. So the Gemara says, so we had machlokes Abaye and Rava. When Eidim become Eidim Zomim, so how does that impact them? So ultimately, again, Abaye says it impacts them lemafreya, so that even going back retroactively, Eidim Eidos that they gave is disqualified. In other words, once you are designated as an Eid Zomim, that's something wrong. Oh, thank you. That impacts ultimately, again, your status, even retroactively. Rava says, no, mikano lahaba. Ultimately, again, it only means from this point going forward. So that's our ongoing machlokis over here, which we have not yet resolved. So let's go. Suppose I'll just point out, just before we get into the Gemara, just understand mitzada hashkafa, that this is an incredibly dramatic machlokis as well. What's the machlokis, I will say? This happens all the time. You find good people who do very bad things. Right? Or good people who do kind of bad things, or good people who just do bad things. Right? But in other words, even the most righteous of people commits averus. And the shaila that often kind of comes up in our mind is, when you see a good person do something bad, how does that reflect on their good activity in the past? Right? You see, right, whatever it happens, a good person does something terrible, and now we wonder, like, okay, so does that mean that now this terrible thing disqualifies everything good that they did in the past? L'mafreya, it turns out that it was never good. Or no, you know what, the good was good. The good was good, now something negative occurred. Obviously, again, that person's status and that person's stature has changed going forward, but the good that they performed in the past, ultimately, again, is still locked in, is still beautiful. This machlokes Abaye and Rava ba'edim zomimin, it's not just a din in Eidos, it's a din in general about how we view when a person fails. When a person fails and fails significantly, how do we view their past accomplishments? So we'll just keep that in mind. We'll have to get to the halacha l'maisa and the hashkafa l'maisa hopefully later on today, if not by Wednesday. So it's not. Ganav al pishnayim, v'tavach umach al pishnayim. Suppose here we go. So the Mishnah said, so Reuven stole an item, right? He stole a sheep or an ox. And what happens? Ganav al pishnayim. So there were two witnesses who gave testimony to the fact that he stole. And then he went ahead and he slaughtered and sold based on their testimony. So now the idea over here in this case is it's the same set of witnesses for both parts. The same set of witnesses ultimately again for Ganav, and the same set of witnesses for Tavach Umachar. Now a word about this. We saw this already in yesterday's daf, but let's just clarify this again. Remember, when you steal, let's say you steal a sheep. You steal and then slaughter/sell a sheep. What's your financial penalty? Sheep? 4. right? 4. It's not 4, right? 4 or 5 is either because it's 5 times for an ox, 4 times for a sheep. So let's just drill down on our numbers over here. What goes into that 4 times penalty payment? So let's say the sheep is worth $100. You're going to have to pay $400, right? 4 times the amount. Let's say what goes into that. So really, what's in there is 2 things. There's kefil. Right? And then on top of kefil, you're going to have to get to 4 times. In other words, it's not 4 times on top of kefil. It's kefil, and then again, essentially another 2 times in order to get you to 4 times the value of the animal. Add on 3 times if it was an ox, right? So that would say that's how this payment happens. The reason why this is important is because this is going to come up in these kind of cases. So now watch this. Reuven stole a sheep from Shimon. Witnesses come along. The same set of witnesses testify that he stole, and then same set of witnesses that he slaughtered it or sold it. Okay, so now what happens? So the Gemara says, V'nimtzu zomamin, and now the witnesses turn out to be edim zomamin. Right, so the witnesses who testified about Reuven stealing and then ultimately again slaughtering and selling were found out to be zomamin. So what's the halacha? Mishalman asakol. Remember again, we'll say what happens to edim zomamin. Right? Edim zomamin is vasisem lo kasher zamam, reciprocal punishment. Whatever they wanted to do, whatever they sought to impose upon the defendant is imposed upon them. Therefore, again, these witnesses, and the cumulative effect of their testimony was what? Arba. They were going to make Reuven chayev 4 times the amount of the sheep. So therefore, Allah Chalamayim, what do we do to them? We impose upon them Arba. Good. Next, so the Gemara says, "My love sheidu al gneva v'chazra v'eidu al tvicha." So we'll say now it's interesting because the way the Mishnah is set up, I will say, is if you look at it, it says that he stole based on the testimony of 2 witnesses. And he also slaughtered and sold based on their testimony as well, which seems to indicate to us they're not giving their testimony like in one fluid testimonial moment, right? Like the witnesses are showing up and they say, we saw Reuven steal and slaughter the sheep. Sounds like instead what's happening over here is they gave testimony about stealing, about theft, and then sometime later gave testimony about selling/slaughtering, which makes sense also because remember, usually theft and slaughtering and stealing are not going to take place at the same time. They're 2 different events. So the Gemara says, let's analyze. So my love, we're not talking about over here. My love, they gave testimony about the theft, and then afterwards gave testimony about the slaughter. Then they were found to be zomamin regarding the testimony of theft, and then they were found to be zomamin on the testimony of slaughtering. So I was supposed to say, so just to play this out for just a second. Witnesses show up. They say, we saw Reuven steal Shimon's sheep on Sunday. Okay? Then they come back on Monday to Beis Din. We saw Shimon, right? We saw, or all this could also be given technically on the same day as well. We saw Shimon slaughter Shimon's sheep on Monday. So both say, now what's the case over here? The case the Gemara says is then a second set of witnesses showed up and said, guys, you cannot have seen Reuven steal the sheep on Sunday because you were with us on Sunday. Is there a game today? Oh, I heard about this, right? It's Nebuch, Miami has to play in Kansas. Is that what? Or was that last night? That was on streaming. Okay, good. It must be difficult. At least they're wearing tight pants. It keeps them warm. No, in the cold weather. So I'll say, so the Gemara is like this. So therefore, we'll say, so now watch this. So now, let's say they say you cannot have seen that. Can you watch it? On 2 times speed? Good. Chevra, by the way, for all of those you listen to any shir or WhatsApp voice notes on 2 times speed, I expect you to do at least the same for your football games. And as the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, therefore the Gemara says like this, if at the end of the day, so now witnesses come along and they say, you could not have observed the theft on Sunday, for you were with us. So therefore, again, they made them zoomim on the theft. And then they said, you could not have observed the slaughter of the animal on Monday because you were with us. So the Gemara says, now watch this. So therefore, this is how the Gemara is setting up this case. So they became zomamin at two different stages. Now, here we go. Now, if you go like Abaye, that when Eidim become Eidim zomamin, they are retroactively disqualified. Which means that what? The moment you became an Eid Zomim, any previous testimony that you gave was also disqualified. If that's the case, Hani Kevan de Ismul Agneva, Iglai Milsal Mafreya, We'll say, watch this. If that's the case, once these witnesses became Eidim Zomamin for the Gneva, for the theft, then what, Rabbi say? Then what? Then they're disqualified witnesses. If they're disqualified witnesses and it turns out that their testimony about the slaughter was what? Was totally irrelevant. Was totally irrelevant. If it's totally irrelevant, then they shouldn't be chayiv for what? For the additional payment for the tvicha. Instead, all they should be on the hook for is the kefel. The kefel. So the Gemara is showing that it must be that Abaye is not correct, and it must be that Eidim Zomamin do not become Zomamin Lemafreya retroactively. Because remember again, the Mishnah, when it quotes this case, holds them accountable for the entire payment 4 times the value of the sheep. But if it was really true that when you become an Eid Zomim, ultimately again you are invalidated Lemafreya retroactively, then once they're proven to be Eidim Zomin on the Gneva, any subsequent testimony is halachically irrelevant, as if they didn't even show up, and therefore they shouldn't be liable. Amri Hacham asking, what's the case here? Kigon shehuzmu ala tvicha tchila. Interesting. The case also over here is they actually were made to be Eidim Zomin first on the testimony regarding the slaughter. See, we thought that kind of the Zomamin thing followed the chronology. In fact, over here, essentially, they were made Eidim Zomamin on the second claim first. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, that's why they can be chayiv for everything. The Gemara says, okay, Amri sof ki hadri missimi agneva igloi milsa. So we'll say that's fine, but at the end of the day, once they do become Eidim Zomamin on the theft, it turns out retroactively it's been clarified. Techi ashadu atavicha pisulan havu. They will say that's fine, even if you want to set it up that they became Eidim Zomamin about the slaughter first, and then only afterwards about the theft. It doesn't matter. Once they're made to be Eidim Zomamin on the theft, then what? It turns out retroactively that when they did testify about the slaughter, they were already invalid witnesses. If that's the case, amay mishalim atavicha. At the end of the day, if that's the case, that they were really invalidated witnesses already at the time they testified regarding the slaughter, then why should they have to pay the reciprocal punishment for that testimony? To which the Gemara says, "V'hilchasa." So I must say, what's the case over here? Sheidu bevas achos v'hosmu. We'll say it must be that the case we're talking about here is where halacha l'maisa, they testified about both the Gneva and the Tevicha at once. Right? So let's say, so we assume that's what, so we were working under the assumption that there were 2 different episodes of testimony. There was an episode on Sunday where they testified that Reuven stole the sheep, and then there was an episode on Monday where they testified that Reuven slaughtered the sheep. But the problem with that is we kept running into an issue that once they become Eidim Zomin for the Gneva, if you go with Abaye, that then you're invalid, L'mafreya as well, then L'maisa any subsequent testimony is irrelevant. If it's irrelevant, then how could they be held responsible for the reciprocal punishment for testimony regarding the slaughter? Rather, the Gemara says, you're right. What's the case? It's one moment of testimony. They're testifying about everything at once. So they're testifying about Geneva and Shchita or Mechira all at once, and therefore halacha l'maisa, when they are made to be zomamin, therefore again there is complete liability for the 4-time penalty payment. Incredible. So let me cut tanaim. So we'll say that this whole thing is a machlokes tanaim. What's machlokes tanaim? Here we go. We'll say quite fascinating. Hayu shnayim me'idin also shaganov. So let's listen to this. Let's say there were 2 people that testified that Reuven stole an object. So 2 witnesses testified that Reuven stole a sheep. Those same 2 witnesses also testified shetavach, that Reuven slaughtered the sheep. Okay, so now we're talking about arba. The huzmu ala gneva, and I will say now what happened? Then the witnesses became Eidim Zomin regarding the gneva. So again, just simple case. So the witnesses testifying that Reuven stole the sheep on Sunday. and that he went ahead and he slaughtered it. Then it turns out that they say you couldn't have seen him stole it on Sunday. You were with us. You are with us. So the Gemara says, so what's the halacha? Eidu shebat la miktsasa bat la kula. So Rabbi say this is very interesting. Now remember, once they become eidim zomim regarding the gneva, then the subsequent testimony regarding the slaughter also falls apart. Right? It just totally falls apart. In other words, because if there's no gneva, then ultimately again it could have been they saw him shecht, but lamaisa, okay, people shecht all the time, so he was shechting his animal, whatever it was. So the Gemara is using lashon over eidu shabbat mitzvah bat lakula, which means once kind of like the anchor of the testimony falls apart, so obviously everything else unravels as well. Now watch this. Huzmu ala tvicha. So the Gemara says hu mishalin tashlumi kefel. So we'll say, so that's if they become zomimin regarding the gneva. What happens both in the following case? When is his show up? They say Reuven stole a sheep from Shimon on Sunday, and then they say, and they show up and they say he shechted it, and they show up on Monday. He shechted it on Monday, and then it turns out they're made zomimin on the shechita. Witnesses show up. You cannot have seen him shechted on Monday. You were with us. So we'll say, now what's the halacha in that case? In that case, remember, so their testimony regarding the theft is still intact. So Reuven is going to have to pay kefel, and the zomimim are going to have to pay shlosha. Shlosha, so to speak, right? In other words, it's talking about a case of chamisha, right? In other words, they're going to have to pay whatever the penalty payment associated with shechita mechira. But so that's why I started out by far. You look at this, you say shlosha. Where does shlosha come from? So remember again, what shlosha represents is the penalty payment for slaughter selling minus the kefel. So whatever that is, that could be shlosha, it could be shtayim, whatever it is. That's why I pointed out before. It's interesting because you wouldn't automatically assume that arba v'chamisha is a cumulative penalty, but it turns out that it is. It actually builds on kefel. In other words, kefel is built into that, and then arba v'chamisha is either 2 or 3 times more above the kefel. So therefore, in this case, they're proven to be zomimin regarding the slaughter, right? But ultimately, again, their testimony regarding the gneva is totally intact. So Reuven is going to be chayiv, ultimately, again, the kefel for the gneva, and the witnesses will be chayiv for any amount of the arba v'chamisha above and beyond the kefel. Incredible. Rabbi Yossi says, when is this so? When is this so? B'shtei eduyos. Now, both say, now we're going to have to translate what these words mean. Right now, we'll assume what it means is 2 testimonial units. 2 testimonial units. Aval be'edos achos, but ultimately, again, if it's just one eidos, again, we'll have to see what that means. But if it's one eidos shebat la mitzvah sabat la kula, ultimately, again, any eidos where part of it ultimately is batal, the entire eidos is batal. So the Gemara says, okay, what does this mean? First of all, look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Dahave mishalem kefal velo batal eidos gneva b'shtei eidos." They will say, now remember again, we're trying to. There is this interesting dynamic over here. So the first case is very intuitive, right? The first case, witnesses show up and they say Reuven stole a sheep from Shimon. That's on Sunday. And then they testify on Monday, Reuven slaughtered the sheep for Shimon. So we'll say, so now, or Reuven slaughtered that same sheep. So now, if they're proven to be zomimin on the testimony that Reuven stole the sheep, then obviously everything falls apart. Eidos shebat la mitzasa bat la kula. The second case is the one that's intriguing to us. They testify that Reuven stole the sheep, but they're made zomimin ultimately again on the testimony regarding the slaughter of the sheep. So in that case, the Gemara says, Reuven, Yechayev Kefel, because there is proper testimony that you stole a sheep, and the witnesses who are now Edim Zomimin will have to pay what we'll call the Arba V'chamisha, but it's really only 3 times or 2 times more, right, for that testimony. So we'll say, so now we're trying to qualify the parameters of that case. So Rabbi Yossi says, when is that so? When is that so? That's only ultimately, again, in a case of two eduyos, straight 2 testimonies. But if it was 1 testimony, then edu shebata miktsasa bat lakulas. Now, okay, so let's define our terms. My b'shtei edyos. What does that mean? 2 testimonies. Umay be'edos achos. What's 1 testimony? So ilema b'shtei edyos mamish. B'shtei kite edus, b'shtei kiteus beidus achos. So we'll say, maybe we'll say like this. Maybe shtei edios means ultimately again two groups of witnesses. Two groups of witnesses, right? B'shtei kitos, two groups. Beidus achos, and bevas achos means b'zeh achar zeh. Ultimately, bas achas means one after the other. Rabbi Yossi says beidus achos, bebas achos. Right, when you have ultimately again one edus who comes, bekat achas, not bebas achas, sorry, bekat achas, ultimately again, so when it's one edus and one group of witnesses, b'zeh achar zeh, so and then they give testimony about the theft and then the slaughter, one after consecutively, ki mishadi agneva, v'hadar mishadi atavicha, so therefore again, when they give testimony first about the theft, and then afterwards again give testimony about the slaughter. Kimissimi atavicha. So ultimately again, when they become a dimzomin regarding the slaughter, edu shebatla mitzasa batla kula, v'itsimu lahu agneva. So we'll say maybe Rabbi Yossi is saying is like this. Watch this. If you're talking about one group of witnesses, right, bekat achos, who are giving consecutive testimonies, right? First testimony about the theft, and then testimony about the slaughter. And what you want to suggest is that ultimately, again, when they become edim zomimin regarding the slaughter, that automatically makes them edim zomimin, or I should say, then it's edu shebatla mitzasa batla kula. Then once part of their testimony becomes negated, the entire testimony becomes negated, including the testimony for the theft. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Why would you say that? Why would you say that? In other words, really, even if it's one set of witnesses that are giving two pieces of testimony consecutively, it's still two different testimonies. So even if they're found to be zomimin regarding the slaughter, why should that impact their testimony regarding the theft? Ella lav b'shtei eduyos. Rather, what you have to say is like this. You have to say it's two different groups. It's two testimonies. So the Gemara says be'edos achos ke'ein shtei eduyos. It's really one testimony that's like two. How is that? So umaynihu kat achos. It's one group of witnesses. So the same two guys, but ultimately again bezeh achar zeh. Ultimately again, but they're giving two different episodes of testimony. Aval be'edos achos. Bevas achas lo. I will say, but at the end of the day, if it was one group of witnesses ultimately giving testimony in one moment, now we're going to see in one moment means Rashi points out over here, besoch kedei dibor. Right? So also we're making, here's the interesting distinction. If it's one group of witnesses, but ultimately again, they're giving essentially halachically what would be considered to be two distinct testimonies, then einachinami, when they become zomamin on the tvicha, on the slaughter, their original testimony regarding the geneva still stands. But if it was one group of witnesses who essentially are giving kind of like one moment of testimony, which includes two parts, then once they become zomamin on one part, then what? Eidos shebatla miksasa batla kula. A very interesting distinction. So the Gemara says, "V'savrua dekuli ama." Now, both say. So now, just let me illustrate this a little bit differently. Right? Witnesses come along, and they say Reuven went ahead and stole a sheep from Shimon. Okay, that's part one of their testimony. Then, in a different testimony, now that different testimony could be, 10 minutes later or 2 days later. They go ahead and they testify that Reuven went ahead and slaughtered the animal. So we'll say, what Rabbi Yossi is suggesting is like this. Those two testimonies are looked at as two independent testimonies. And therefore, obviously, if they become zomimin on the geneva, then what happens to the rest of the testimony? It falls off, right? Because if there's no geneva, there's anything else. But if they become zomimin on the slaughter, on the tevicha, then I will say what that does is it negates that testimony. But what still remains? The geneva testimony. And therefore, Reuben's going to have to pay kefel. The edim zomimin will have to pay the 3 times, 2 times, or 3 times penalty amount. However, Rabbi Yossi is suggesting, if let's say Rabbi say in one act of testimonial kite, right? They go ahead and they give everything over. Right? One breath. We hereby testify that we saw Reuven go ahead and steal the animal and also slaughter it. Saras b'nei Hama, right? One breath, right? They put everything in there. It doesn't have to be one breath, but what it does have to be is toch kedei dibur. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Just in one speech, right? In one verbal unit of testimony. Then Rabbi Yossi says, what happens there? That now becomes one testimonial unit. Once it becomes one testimonial unit, if any part of that testimony is discredited, whether it's the gneva or whether it's the tvicha, then edus shebatla miktsasa batla kula. Once one part of that cohesive testimonial unit becomes undone, then ultimately all of it is undone. So the Gemara says, "V'savro dukol yama," and everyone would agree that toch kedei dibor kedibor dami. So we'll say ultimately again, everyone agrees that we've seen this concept before. Toch kedei dibor. We'll define our terms in just a little bit, but toch kedei dibor refers to anything that you say with two articles or two parts of speech that are said within immediate proximity of one another. Right? I say something and then I say another follow-up statement right after it. Those two statements ultimately are combined. That's what it means to say toch kedei dibor. And I will say we have many examples of toch kedei dibor. We'll see some over here. But toch kedei dibor says that any two utterances that you recite within immediate proximity of each other become one cohesive verbal unit. So therefore Rabbi Yossi is suggesting if witnesses give two pieces of testimony, toch kedei dibor, within a verbal immediacy of one another, they become one harmonious testimonial unit. And therefore, if any part of that is disproven, the entire piece, the entire testimony simply unravels and fades away. Incredible. So the Gemara says, watch this. So what are they arguing about? So I'll say if everybody really agrees with toch kedei dibor dami, then ultimately again, what are they arguing about? Here we go. Rabbanan savri mikano la'aba. So we'll say, now the Gemara wants to suggest maybe this really goes back to the original machlokes Abaye and Rava about what happens when edim are found to be zomamin. Does your zomamin status extend only prospectively, or ultimately again does it extend ultimately retrospectively as well? That's the machlokes. Rabbanan savri mikana la'aba nifsal. Rabbanan, when you become an eid zomeim, that status extends going forward. V'chevan damahi shaita kamissimi. And since, ultimately, again, I will say now, watch what happens over here. This is actually quite fascinating. So since now you become an eid zomim from this point going forward, so therefore again, so mihashita kamitsimi atvicha the kamitsimi itzum agneva lo mitzimi lo itzum. So according to the Rabbanan, halacha lemaisa. Halacha l'maisa, the Rabbanan hold that when you become an eid zomim, it's only mikano lahaba, since the witnesses in this case were made zomimin on the tevicha and not on the geneva. So their testimony regarding the geneva stands, and their edim zomin ultimately on the tevicha. However, watch this. Rabbi Yossi savar lemafreya hu nifsal. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, says that no, when you become an eid zomim, that status extends even retroactively. B'chevan demiyad ki asiduhu demifsali ki itzemu lahu atvicha itzemu Nami Agneva Daha Toch Kedei Dibor Kedibor Dami. So it says incredible. So Rabbi Yossi holds like this. Rabbi Yossi holds that halacha l'maisa, when you become ultimately an eid zomim on the tevicha, right, on the slaughter, then what happens? Retroactively it goes back to the geneva, and even more so since the geneva eidos was done toch kedei dibor. Therefore halacha l'maisa, you become an eid zomim on the entire testimony. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Amri, itoch kedei dibor kedibor dami dekuli amal mafreya hu nifsal. So I'll say, you're right. The truth is, if you would hold toch kedei dibor dami, then I will say everyone would agree that your eidus zomin status would extend retroactively. And I was about to say, I just want to point this out, very interesting. We normally assume that when we think about toch kedei dibor and attaching two statements to form one cohesive verbal unit, we always think about this as a concept of what? Forward. Right? I say, I make a declaration A, make declaration B, and then they come together. The Gemara says, interestingly enough, toch kedei dibor works both ways. Right? So therefore, it's very interesting that halacha l'maisa, if you'll talk kedei dibur kedibur dummy, and you go ahead and now you're giving witnesses giving testimony about geneva and then tvicha, and then they are found to be zomamin, right, on the tvicha, and the tvicha and geneva edus was given toch kedei dibur, everybody would agree that what? That halacha l'maisa, you are an eid zomim even for the geneva as well. Which is really quite fascinating. Quite fascinating. So rather, what's machlokes here? Both say, get ready for this. Super exciting. Elahacha, besoch kedei dibur, sorry. Elahacha, besoch kedei dibur, kedibur dami kamiflagi. Wow. Both saying, this concept that we always took for granted, that is a truth, held by everyone, is in fact the subject of a machlokes. Is toch kedei dibur kedibur dami, or not? I will say, when you make two statements, and those two statements are made, right, with verbal immediacy. You make statement one, and then immediately after you make statement two. Are those two statements attached or not? And when we say attached, by the way, attached means a number of different things. Attached can mean the second one modifies the first, the second one changes the first. But the point of view is that they're attached. I will say that concept of toch kedei dibur kedibur dami is in and of itself a machlokes. Here we go. Rabbanan Savri toch kedei dibur Amud Beis, Lav Kedibor Dami. Wow. The Rabbana hold, no, Toch Kedei Dibor, even if you make two statements within verbal immediacy of one another, it is not considered to be like one statement. And therefore, take a look, Tap Rashi Amud Beis, Lav Kedei Dibor Dami. Rashi says, V'havalu Shnei Edios, Umishum Chada Lo Ischachash Idach, the Mishas Dibor Achron Nifsalu, V'lo Mishas Dibor Rishon. The Rabbanan hold that we don't say Toch Kedei Dibor Kedibor Dami. And therefore what? When witnesses come along and give testimony about Geneva, and then even though Toch Kedei Dibor, they then give testimony about what? Tvicha. And they're proven to be zomin regarding the Tvicha, that only impacts the Tvicha, the slaughter, and doesn't impact the Geneva. Incredible. Rabbi Yossi holds Toch Kedei Dibor Kedibor Dami. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, holds that no, halacha l'maisa, we say toch kedei dibur kedibur dami, and therefore halacha l'maisa, when witnesses give testimony about geneva, and then toch kedei dibur give testimony about tvicha, and are proven to be edim zomin regarding the tvicha, what happens? They're disqualified for the geneva as well. Incredible. So the Gemara says, now really, is that true? So the Gemara says, V'sa Rabbi Yossi toch kedei dibur kedibur dami? Does Rabbi Yossi really hold that toch kedei dibur is kedibur? We'll say, watch, this is so interesting. V'hatanan, we learned, Harezet temuras ola, temuras shlamim. Watch this case, I will say. I have an animal. Right? And now let's say again, and I say, this animal should be in exchange for an ola, exchange for a shlam. Now, both we're talking about already a sacrificially designated animal. So remember again, what's the halacha? Torah tells us, right, that when you have a sacrificially designated animal, you may not exchange that for another animal. Okay? So now what happens? So, by the way, and if you go ahead and you make an animal a tmura, then what happens? We'll say, both animals are consecrated, right? So if I, for example, have a shlamim, and I decide, you know what, I don't want to offer up this animal, so I want to offer up this animal. So I exchange animal A for animal B, they're both shlamim. Now in this case, the owner of the animal did something very interesting. He said, let this animal be temuras ola, temuras shlamim. Let this animal be in exchange for a temura, for an ola and for a shlamim. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? Hare zu temuras ola div Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, Rabbi Meir holds the concept. Rashi points out over here. Rabbi Meir holds. Now we'll say, I just want to point out, this statement is an impossibility, right? An animal cannot be simultaneously an ola and the shlamim. Right? It's not possible. So over here, Ruvain will call him. Ruvain is making this sheep a temura for an ola and for a shlamim. It doesn't work. So Meir says, we treat it as a temura for an ola. They will say, why? Rabbi Meir subscribes to the concept of tafas lashon rishon. That whenever you make two statements, and they are contradictory, inherently contradictory, so the halacha is that ultimately, again, you seize the first lashon. So therefore, the first thing he said is make this a temuras ola. Therefore, it's a temuras ola. Rabbi Yossi says, "Im lekachnis kavin mitchila Hoil v'efshar likro shnei shemos ke'echad devarav kayamin. I will say, listen to this. Rabbi Yossi says, well, look, you know what? We ask Ruvain, what did you have in mind? What did you have in mind? And I will say, so if Ruvain says, listen, my kavanah was, I want this animal to be a temura for both Ola and Shlamim. That's what he says. So I will say, if that's his kavanah, we say, okay, Dvarav Kayamin. Then we make it a temura for Ola and Shlamim. I will say, how do you make one animal temura for an Ola and a Shlamim? So Rashi points out a very interesting process. Rashi says, well, essentially what we do is you take this animal, we let it graze. We let it graze until it develops a mum. Once it develops a mum, what do? You redeem it, right? Redeem it. And now you have the money. And what do you do with the money? Half for Ola, half for Shlamim. Incredible. Incredible. V'im amar. So we'll say, by the way, let's finish. V'im amar temuras ola v'nimlach v'amar temuras shlamim. And we'll say, if at the end of the day, so we'll say, okay, let me say one thing. Interesting. This idea of you let it graze and then you use half of the money for an ola, half the money for shlamim. We'll say, can you buy an ola or a shlamim for half of the amount? I guess if it's a very expensive animal, you can. But bepashtos, you'll have a little bit of money for this and a little bit of money for that, and you're probably going to have to supplement it with your own money. Let's say you see something incredible over here. When a person doesn't have clarity about what they want to accomplish, you get absolutely nowhere in life. And I will say, if you think about it, for many of us, this is the very issue that we run into. Let's see, ever sometimes look at life and wonder, why am I not where I want to be? Am I the only person this happens to? Okay, maybe. All right, why am I not where I want to be? Right? I'm not in life where I want to be. So why is that? It's not because of a lack of effort, willing to work hard, right? Willing to put in the effort. Say more often than not, it's because you've spoken of this many times. I don't have clarity of vision. I don't have clarity of a goal. I don't know the finish line I am working towards. And if you don't know what you're working towards, if you don't know what the intended goal is, if you don't have clarity and vision, of course you can't get where you want to go because you don't have clarity on what that goal is. I will say that's this case. Harizit Tmuras Ola, Tmuras Shlamim. Pick a team. Pick a team. Right? Decide what you're doing. Decide what you're doing. So the Gemara says, okay, can you do both? Can you do both? Yeah, you could do both. And what happens when you do both? You have a little money for Ola, a little money for Shlamim, and what happens, as they say, Anishtahin Nishtaher, right? So you don't have Ola, you don't have Shlamim, you're kind of just dabbling in a whole bunch of stuff. And I will say, especially in today's day and age, where we have become, what's the Lashon? Proficient at many things, masters of none. Jack of all trades, master of none, right? So I will say it's incredible, right? We're doing so many different things, but the truth is, what am I really good at? What am I really putting my focus on? What's the goal? What's the finish line? That's this guy. This guy. This is me. Hareza olait temuras ola temuras shlamim. I like a little ola. I like a little shlamim on it. There's some of this, some of that. Go here, diffuse the tension. And I never really get to where I want to get to. It works. You can get by in life like that. A little bit of money will be left for ola, a little bit of money left for shlamim. But at the end of the day, I'm not left with anything concrete. If you want to accomplish something in life, a person has to have clarity of vision. Also, I want to point out, the clarity of vision doesn't have to be, for the next 50 years, here's what I want to work on. It could be clarity of vision for today. Today, I have clarity of vision. Here is what I want to accomplish. A, B, and C. It could be clarity of vision for the week. It could be clarity of vision for the month, for the year. Yeah, a person could have 5-year and 10-year plans. Absolutely. But just clarity of vision. I know exactly what I want to do and how I want to accomplish. Because if you don't, then you're the Hare Zu Turas Ola Temura Shlamim guy. Where does it work? It does work. You have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but you haven't really advanced your life agenda. Incredible. Now, if Reuven said, first he said Timuras Ola, and then he changed his mind, and then he said Timuras Shlamim, Harezu Timuras Ola, ultimately, we'll say then it's going to be a Timuras Ola, because that's the first thing he said. But we asked, Nimlach Pshita. Obviously, I'm going to say if he changed his mind, Nimlach pshita, v'amar Papa nimlach b'soch k'dei dibor kaminon. I will say ultimately again, Rav Papa said he was nimlach b'soch k'dei dibor. So I'll say the point over here is, what do you see? You see over here that this second opinion ultimately is saying that changing your mind toch k'dei dibor works. Yet, Rabbi Yossi does not subscribe to changing your mind toch k'dei dibor. So we'll say now we have a problem. Because we were just saying above that Rabbi Yossi holds that toch k'dei dibor is k'dibor dami. And now based on this case of Tamura, it would appear that Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold of toch k'dei dibor k'dibor dami. We'll say this is amazing. Amri, the Gemara answers, you're right. Toch trei toch k'dei dibor havi. This is incredible. There are two toch k'dei dibors. There's two different shiurim. Chad k'dei she'ilas talmid l'rav, v'chad k'dei she'ilas harav l'talmid. Incredible. I'll say two different toch k'dei dibors. One is the amount of time that it takes for a talmid to inquire about the welfare of his rebbe, and the other is the amount of time that it takes for a rebbe to inquire about the welfare of his talmid. Now, we'll say, what are the two shiurim? When a talmid inquires about the welfare of his rebbe, it is Shalom Alecha Rebbe Umori. Okay? When it is the Rav asking about the welfare of the talmid, it is Shalom Alecha. So one is longer, one is shorter. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Ki les leil Rabbi Yossi k'dei she'elas talmid l'Rav. So we'll say Rabbi Yossi holds toch k'dei dibor is k'dibor dami when? For the shorter amount. Ultimately, again, from the Rav to the Talmud. Shalom Alecha. When doesn't he subscribe to Toch K'dei Dibor K'dibor Dami? The amount of time it takes for the Talmud to inquire about the welfare of the Rebbe. Shalom Alecha, Rebbe Umori. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Shalom Alecha, Rebbe Umori, dinafish. So again, Rabbi Yossi won't hold toch k'dei dibor k'dibor dami for the longer toch k'dei dibor, which ultimately again is shalom alecha Rabbi Yomori. K'dei she'elas harav l'talmid, the amount of time that it takes ultimately again for the Rebbe to inquire about the welfare of the Talmud, which is just shalom alecha, is like that Rabbi Yossi does subscribe to. So I will say it's pretty incredible. So first of all, again, we weren't even expecting this, right? This is like bonus material. We just thought ultimately again that we were hyper focused over here. Still in the machlokes Abai and Rava. It turns out that halacha l'maisa, there's a much bigger machlokes underway over here, namely the machlokes about toch k'dei dibor k'dibor dami. So it turns out like this. So first of all, the Rabbanan seem to totally reject the concept of toch k'dei dibor k'dibor dami. Rabbi Yossi accepts it, but even Rabbi Yossi who accepts toch k'dei dibor k'dibor dami is only the shorter shear of toch k'dei dibor k'dei she'elas harav l'talmid shalom alecha. But for the longer amount of time, ultimately again, of Shalom Alecha Rebbe Umori, that Rabbi Yossi does not subscribe to. Both say, beautiful. What's still outstanding over here? What's still outstanding is Machlokes Abai in Rava. We're not finished. Let's just do two more lines, then we'll stop. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Eidim Shulch Shulu Basof Hozmu Neheragin. So Rabbi say, here's an interesting, let's begin this sugya today, and then Emirat Hashem continue it really in full force tomorrow, and also loop back to Abai Rava. We're not finished with that yet. So Rabbi says like this, what happens if you have Eidim who first were refuted, and not refuted, Hukshu means contradicted, and then found to his own. So let me paint this case for you. Right? Witnesses show up. We'll just call them A and B. A and B show up and they testify that Ruvain killed Shimon. Okay. Another two witnesses show up and they say Ruvain didn't kill Shimon. Okay, so now what happens over here is you have just contradicted testimony. They both say, now what happens when you have two testimonial units who contradict each other? What happens? They cancel each other out. After that, another set of witnesses comes. So remember again, first set of witness, we'll call it set A, testified that Ruvain killed Shimon. Set B testified that Ruvain didn't kill Shimon. Set C comes along and says, A, you could have never testified about that. Why? You were with us on Sunday. Okay? So now watch what's happened to set A. Set A has been contradicted, and now they've become Eidim Zommin. So what's the now obviously what's the Shaila? So do we go ahead and put set A to death? Because remember again, there's reciprocal punishment. what set A sought to do was to administer a death penalty to Reuven. Now set A has become Eidim Zomim, but first they were contradicted. So what's their status? So the Gemara says, so Rava says, Eidim Shuchshu Ulubasof Chuzmu Neheragim. So Rava says we treat them as Eidim Zomim. Why? Ta'achosha Tchilas Hazomahi Ela Shalom Nigmara. So Rava said this is actually quite fascinating because Rava says inherent in the process of Hazama is contradiction. That is, Rose say, when you make Eidim Zomamin, kind of inherently, what's in that process? What's in that process? You are contradicting their testimony. So in other words, you might have thought that once they become contradicted witnesses or canceled witnesses, right? Canceled witnesses. So therefore, I would have thought that what? That halacha l'maisa now, they're done. They're done and they're no longer subject to hazama. Rava says no, they're not done because essentially every single time you make witnesses Eidim Zomin, included in that process is a contradiction. Is a contradiction of that initial testimony, and therefore halacha l'maisa Rava says we administer full reciprocal punishment to these witnesses. Amar Rava says Menamina. Where do I know this from? The Tanya, because we learned, Me'idoni bi'ish ploni shesime es ein avdos. Well, it's a very interesting case here. I testify about so-and-so, right? Witnesses come along. I testify that Reuven blinded the eye of his Eved. Vehepil esheno, and he knocked out his tooth. Shari harav omer kain, and the master agrees with this. Okay, we'll see what all this means. V'nimtzu zomin, then it turns out that the witnesses are zomin. Mishalman demei ayin le'eved. Ultimately, again, they go ahead and they pay the value of the eye to the Eved. So the Gemara says, hey Chidami, what's the case over here? What's the case? We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Meretz Hashem with this case tomorrow. There's a dramatically fascinating case. We'll loop back then to Rava and Meretz Hashem tomorrow. We'll see the halacha l'maisa ultimately again on the Abayi Rava Machlokes as well. We'll say tremendous. Shkoyach everyone. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.